Well, my fiance and I were supposed to get married in 1990 in Yosemite, but the wedding expenses were piling up and with it, a ton of stress. We decided, heck with it, we don't need to spend all that money on a wedding. Let's have some fun and take a trip to the mainland instead. We were living in Hawaii, where I was born and raised. My fiance is a country boy from Northern California. We decided to save money, though, that we would camp in every state and national park in the western U.S. that we could in the 3 weeks that we had off of work, starting in California. There, we rented a car, packed it up with our tent and our gear and our cooler, and hit the road. We began at Yosemite National Park, California, and then various state parks in Colorado. Finally, we headed to Yellowstone, Wyoming, where we enjoyed exploring any and all abandoned-looking buildings and houses. There were a few creepy ones along the way. On the highway to Yellowstone, Wyoming, we saw an old abandoned-looking farm building in the middle of nowhere, several yards off the highway. My fiance and I decided to walk over to it. There you could hear the flies buzzing around it and smell something bad from far away. We decided to go in anyway. And upon opening the door, the sights and the smells were overwhelming. Meat, or pieces of it, and animal bodies were everywhere. My fiance said the animals were elk. There were so many. There must have been dozens of them. Elk heads, elk legs, elk hides, antlers, slabs of meat hanging from the rafters, blood splattered on the walls and on the ground. It was a living nightmare. My fiance said that the elk looked like they were literally torn apart. He said that nothing there had been cut with a knife. He also reasoned that none of these creatures were being processed for meat or skins or anything because all the parts, like the heads, the hides, the antlers, were still there. I started shaking. I felt like I was going to pass out. I started crying. I had never seen such a gory scene. I told my fiance to call the police. He said, whatever happened here, he didn't want any part of it. We hurriedly got back into the car. We headed to Yellowstone National Park. Here we heard the story again on the radio that we'd been hearing for the last week, that a woman hiker was camping alone in a remote area of Yellowstone Park, and they found her torn apart by what they believe is a grizzly bear. After experiencing the contents of the farm building, and knowing that there could be a killer bear on our next destination, we were nervous. And we got to the park and did all the touristy things like Old Faithful and the Old Faithful Inn, and there were many miles of newly burnt forest from the recent forest fires. We also saw the gorgeous geothermal pools. Once we were ready to settle in, we found an out-of-the-way campsite, as we really did not like camping in loud, crowded areas. This was late September and the park was virtually empty. Only a few people were there camping. There was a bathroom within walking distance and a picnic table and a grill. There were also signs all over warning about bears and safe food storage. This did not help to calm my nerves after the farm building and the story about the lady hiker on the radio. We had a couple of beers, a little dinner, and then we went to sleep in the tent. Back then, I would get hungry in the middle of the night, so I thought it would be okay to take a bag of overripe pears into the tent with me. It would be okay if I hid them under my pillow. I thought it would be covered enough so that nothing could smell them. Remember now, I am from Hawaii, where there are no predatory animals, just sharks. Well, we fell asleep, and I don't know how long I had been asleep when awakened by the sudden feeling of what can only be described as a massive weight pressing down on the right side of my body. It was on the outside of the tent. The weight was on my right arm, the right side of my chest, and all the way to my right hip. I felt pinned like a car had parked on me. My first thought was, oh God, it's a bear. I know it's a bear. It must smell the pears. That's why it's almost sitting on my head. I was waiting for the bear to begin to paw or claw at the tent to gain access to the pears. I looked over to see my fiance was fast asleep on my left side, silently dreaming, blissfully unaware, never snoring like a dead person as usual. I knew better than to wake him up. That would require me to move. I decided that if this was a bear, I know I'd better not move. And don't panic. Maybe it's a stupid bear and it doesn't know it's sitting on a tent with a person inside. As the time went by, I kept expecting movement from it, at least for it to paw at the tent or to start sniffing around or to shift its weight, but it never moved. My thoughts got weirder and stranger as the seconds turned into minutes and the minutes turned into hours. I reasoned, this cannot be a bear or a bison or a deer or an elk or a squirrel or a raccoon or a possum or a badger. This cannot be any of those or any animal on earth, because living creatures breathe and they move. Had this been a bear, it would have easily just torn that tent fabric open and ripped my head off to get at those pears under my pillow. In fact, the only consistent sensation I was feeling was this heavy something, was that it was warm and it was heavy, and it never twitched or any other type of movement normal for a living being. As the time went by and these swirling thoughts went through my head, I was scanning data banks of what in this world is sitting on me. What type of animal sits and doesn't move? What kind of animal is so heavy and does not breathe? I was terrified. I instinctively knew that whatever this was, it was not of our world. It must have been there unmoving, warm, and extremely heavy, sitting on the outside of the tent on me for several hours. I couldn't handle the terror any longer. I passed out cold. The next morning, I woke up. My fiance had been up a while. The thing that had pinned me down and terrified me all night was gone. The moment I got up to move, I knew that this had been no nightmare or any kind of a dream. The entire right side of my body was aching. I could barely move from the after effects of adrenaline and fear. I told my fiance what had happened. His reply was to scold me for taking food into the tent. He didn't even care about all the fear that I still had or what had happened. I examined the tent fabric. Nothing, no marks, no animal prints, no sign that any huge, massive creature had sat on the tent for several hours. The tent was fine, but I wasn't. My entire body was sore, and I was still scared. I was in a daze, but despite this daze, we packed up and headed to our next destination, Glacier National Park, Montana. While driving there, we heard on the radio that someone had been attacked overnight by wolves in the park. I said no way. I refused to go. I insisted that we turn around and camp somewhere else. I no longer had a desire to visit Glacier National Park, so we turned around and headed back to Wyoming. We finally found an isolated area near the town of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that was not part of a park or any designated camping area. It was getting dark and we had to set up our camp. As we were setting up the tent, I began to get the weirdest feeling from around the forest of being watched and of extreme danger. That same feeling of fear from the night before crept up on me. Suddenly I heard thunder clapping in the distance, and that was it for me. I told my boyfriend there was no way I was going to camp there either. There was something wrong with that area. My fiance got pretty upset. He thought that spot was just fine. I started freaking out. I told him we had to leave. I did not think I could camp there or anywhere again. We found a bed and breakfast room for the night in the nearby town, and then not long after, we headed back to Hawaii. I never forgot that incident at Yellowstone, that feeling of terror in the darkness, and the images of what I saw in that farm building still flash through my mind. As a matter of fact, not a day has gone by where I don't flash upon that memory of the terror in the tent for just a few seconds. I can honestly say that I've never been that frightened before or since. I began to research what this thing could possibly be that I encountered that night. I began to read and hear similar stories online from people telling their terrifying camping encounters. One day, I heard a Sasquatch researcher tell a story on a YouTube live stream about campers being harassed by Bigfoot while in their tents. He said I was lucky because other people were picked up while asleep in their tents and dragged a few feet or carried away altogether from their campground. The researcher said it was probably a juvenile that sat on me at Yellowstone, as they do this as a show of dominance. He said that Sasquatch are capable of remaining still, literally unmoving for hours at a time. An extensive study of this stillness phenomena has been done by a Sasquatch researcher on the east coast of the U.S. It is the most fascinating piece regarding this aspect of their behavior. Apparently, they are able to slow down their breathing as a defense mechanism. That is probably why I felt only warmth coming through the tent and never detected any breathing. Hope you enjoyed my true story. I never saw the creature. My instincts and having this cryptid sit on me for several hours told me that whatever this was, it is not an animal or a person. It was not a vehicle parked on me. It was not a dream or sleep paralysis. I have never been that awake or that afraid before or since that incident. I recently tried to look up the details surrounding the grizzly attack on that woman in Yellowstone in September of 1990, as well as the wolf attack at Glacier National Park during the same time period. Despite hearing about both incidents repeatedly on the radio during our trip, there's nothing online about either incident. What I find strange is that the elk that we had found in that building were all torn apart. That lady's injuries at Yellowstone were described as she was torn apart, and the wolf attack injuries were also described this way. Was there a killer cryptid on the loose in the fall of 1990 in Wyoming and Montana? Maybe it was just a bear or just wolves, but tearing apart is not usually how they eat their victims, is it? I am glad I did not become one of them.